Ari, as I read your bubble watch column, a couple things pop into my mind because I'm just imagining these various fan bases or groups of people yelling at you on the internet. And I want to imagine like they're actual in real life people as a group yelling at you in real life, like in the mall. Because I think that would be hilarious. Like, how can you have Iowa State in the bracket? Or the opposite, because these people will not be the same people. Another group of people going, how can you leave Alabama? And don't you know they lost to Vanderbilt?
Yeah, I think that you and I had them in the same spot, right? Did you have them at 8 too? I can't remember. But yeah.
I did. I had them at 8. Yep.
I have a few teams in here that I think are probably going to raise some eyebrows, right? Like Indiana, I put in my field at number 11. UNLV, not often you see a group of 5 team lose and then
stay in,
let alone not fall off the face of the earth. And then Iowa State, I decided I thought was worthy of this. Now, I go into this week knowing damn well, Andy, that the Big 12 is absolutely insane and that anything could happen, including Iowa State losing 3 games in the league this year. But I looked at the paths to these teams when I was doing this. Like, a lot of it isn't just who did they beat right now or, what's their record right now. It's what are they going to have to contend with coming down the pike. And the thing that I had a hard time with, and, we do these at 3 a.m. after the long day, and I didn't want to bother you, but like the number one jarring thing about my bracket is if you pay really close attention, there are only 3 SEC teams in it. And I'm not sure that that's actually what's going to play out here. I think it's possible it turns into 4 or 5 by the time this is all said and done. But there was nobody in the first 4 out or the next 4 out that I thought was either good enough or had an easier path to getting to where you would need to be to get in at this point. So granted, I know that Indiana, has a open week and still has to play Michigan and Ohio State, but those are the 2 biggest games left. And they probably, in my opinion, think they should beat Michigan. And then if you go look at Iowa State, they don't play a game that they can't win. Maybe for the rest of their schedule, and their toughest 2 games aren't to the final 2 against Utah and Kansas State. So, I mean, is Iowa State going to beat West Virginia, UCF, Texas Tech, Kansas, Cincinnati? I mean, probably not, because it's the Big 12 and you never know what you're going to get there. But those are all teams that I think that they could and should beat. So, there's some runway there for these teams to be there for a while. So that said, BYU's number 4 in the Big 12. And it's just like you have Texas Tech and Kansas State in the next 4 out. Like, there's a lot of Big 12 cross-pollination there that's going to have to bear out in the results of the games.
Yeah, and you're going to make the SEC is overrated crowd really happy with this one. They're going to love that you have only 3 SEC teams, and even though you think that's probably not what actually ultimately happens. I want to look at your first 4 out again because I think it's very, very interesting, and these are teams that could make moves. So Tennessee, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, Ole Miss. Tennessee loses to Arkansas. That's how they wind up here. Notre Dame still trying to come back from the loss to Northern Illinois, but the win against Texas A&M looks better because Texas A&M beat Arkansas last week and crushed Missouri this week. Meanwhile, you got Ole Miss. The loss to Kentucky was bad, but then Ole Miss goes on the road and hammers South Carolina. So of those 4, who do you think has the best chance of being in the bracket and off of that bubble next week?
That's a really difficult question because I'm looking for some proof of concept from Ole Miss, and I don't know who they have to play next week off the top of my head right now.
They play LSU at LSU. Big game.
So I think that could definitely help. When you look at let's just go down the list here. When you look at Ole Miss, you want to see proof that they're good. And like, I know that going on the road and beating South Carolina is, quasi difficult for SEC standards, but that's not a win that you get forgiven for losing to Kentucky with. They got LSU and Oklahoma and Arkansas and Georgia the next 4 games. Like, if you're an Ole Miss fan and you're upset they're not in, well, you got a nice little month ahead of you here to prove whether you're worthy or not. And,
I don't think LSU. They have to win all those games to get in.
Yeah, I think if they beat LSU, I think you might be able to have a discussion about IU or Iowa State there at the end. And the thing that actually happened here, Andy, is that last week I got into a lot of fights with people on social media about, brand bias and, resume and actually just thinking things through. And it's like, I just truthfully believe that Indiana has done more than some of these teams behind them to prove that they could do it, and they have an easier schedule. So that's why it's up there. Do I think Indiana would beat Tennessee tomorrow? I don't know that I think that. But with the bubble watch, it's a little bit easier too, because you have more context every week to work off of. So I mean, if I had to guess, in terms of teams that I think could probably climb their way back in, I don't think it's going to be Tennessee, because they're playing, I believe, Florida next week. I think that Ole Miss
Florida
probably
in Knoxville.
Ole Miss is probably the team that could jump in there, because A&M, Tennessee, and Notre Dame aren't going to knock my socks off. But I think, too, you have to also stay on guard with the fact that they might just find their way in when teams in front of them lose this week.
Well, and you also have the possibility, let's say Oklahoma beats Texas. We weren't even talking about them. But if Oklahoma beats Texas, they have one loss, and it's to Tennessee. And if they beat Texas, I think there's a good chance you would put them in your bracket and maybe jump them over some of these teams.
Yeah.
But do you jump them over? You might not jump them over Tennessee. So it might push them both in. Who knows?
Well, the thing that's interesting about this is that if you start getting results like that, Andy, you could be in a world where you have 9 SEC teams that are having a discussion about this, and it's like at a certain point, you're just flat out guessing on who's going to do what, because there's a lot, like even LSU is the next 4 out there. You've got 4 SEC teams out of the next 5 getting into the tournament there that are just kind of waiting in the wings to do something. So, I think Notre Dame is a team that we have discussed a lot on this podcast, Andy, and they didn't play this week, but I think that their resume got a little bit better. I think that they are a team that is just going to keep quietly winning, because they don't really have any huge games. And if they go out and beat a service academy, then I think they'll be firmly into the field as well. So, I mean, you look at their schedule here, they got Stanford, Georgia Tech, and then Navy. So once they get to the Navy game, if they're able to win that one, that's going to be 3 more wins on their schedule. Northern Illinois is going to be 3 weeks further removed from our memories, and they're going to be right back into the field.
SMU is in your next 4 out. And I'm fascinated by them, because we're not going to see them again for a couple weeks. They don't play till October 19th at Stanford, which is a game they should win. Then they're at Duke. Then they play Pitt. Those are games against, Duke's only lost once. Pitt is still undefeated. Now, they might not be by the time they play. But SMU has gone from, let's hope they have a good first year in the ACC, to legitimately, can they make the ACC championship game?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you go and you look at the first 3 weeks of their season, being in Dallas and knowing some people who love SMU, it was a pretty rough look. I mean, they almost lost to Nevada in the first game of the season, and then they lost to BYU, and you're like, what the hell's going on here? Now, it turns out that BYU is a lot better than people thought. So when you start looking at their actual resume's whole picture, you get to a point where it's actually a pretty okay resume. And you never would have thought coming in that they would be 2-0 in ACC play with Florida State and Louisville as their first 2 games. But it turns out that this team isn't very deep, or this conference, I should say, isn't very deep. And even the top layer there is questionable. So you look at the ACC, and they don't play Clemson and they don't play Miami in the regular season this year. So when you're talking about the next 4 out, you're talking about teams that rank in between 16 and 20. SMU's schedule bears out pretty good for a team that could finish 10-2 and be in that window.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Notre Dame's going to be really interesting to watch. You mentioned Notre Dame and Navy playing one another. Navy's another one because they're in the American Athletic Conference race. You talked about UNLV and Boise State. They're going to play a week from Friday night in Vegas. It is most likely the first of 2 matchups if all goes according to plan for those 2 teams. So a lot of exciting football to come. Huge games this week that will affect the bubble watch. The Ole Miss LSU game is a big one. You got K-State, Colorado. You have Colorado on your next,
and that's another team.
You have K-State on your next 4 out, but let's say Colorado beats them. I was going to say, I gave some suddenly appears here.
I gave some consideration to Colorado already because they've turned it around in a way that I didn't think they were able to do. So if Colorado goes out and beats Kansas State, then you have to start really considering the notion that this team could play for a Big 12 championship at some point, right? Like it's not a sideshow when you win these games. So yeah, that is one of the games of the week coming up. And if Colorado somehow wins that football game and remains unbeaten in the Big 12, then they find themselves center stage in the middle of this whole conference that is just kind of a mess.
Yeah, it's all going to be fascinating. The Big 12 race is going to be every week another minefield bombshell coming down. But I think the SEC showed that it's going to be like that too. So I can't wait. Cannot wait. I want to see this bubble next week because I think it's going to change dramatically after these games. Ari, we'll talk about it again next week.